All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we're doing our All-22 film review from the Falcons' Week 8 loss to the Carolina Panthers. We'll be answering a listener question about Russell Gage. But speaking of a Falcons wide receiver, the Falcons made a bold move by signing Marvin Hall. We'll talk about why that move is better late than never, as well as how Hall's explosiveness could enhance this Falcons offense moving forward.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com. RIP. Still going strong, however, on Twitter at FalcFans. Putting up weekly content over at the Falcoholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons. And of course, the host of this world-renowned Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. In today's episode, we are going to be talking quite a bit about Marvin Hall, the Falcons' latest signing that they made, the addition on Tuesday. We'll talk about why it's good that the Falcons finally made this move after several weeks of me on this podcast clamoring for that move. We'll talk about the added explosiveness and how that could help enhance the Falcons offense and why explosiveness is so necessary to have success in today's NFL. And then we'll get into the All-22 portion of today's episode where we review the film, and we'll be answering a listener question about another wide receiver on the Falcons roster in Russell Gage and whether or not his lack of targets was due to the fact that he was not getting open. So we'll get into all of that on today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But before we get there, guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. And of course, now available on YouTube. Go subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. Make sure you leave a comment. Make sure you give us a like as well when you head over to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. So the big news on Tuesday was that the Falcons signed Marvin Hall. And for those of you that are wholly unfamiliar with Marvin Hall, how dare you? But if you don't know who Marvin Hall is, he was an undrafted free agent that originally signed with the Oakland Raiders, the then Oakland Raiders, out of the University of Washington way back in 2016. He finished his rookie season on the Arizona Cardinals practice squad before the Falcons wound up scooping him up in the summer of 2017. And then he would carve out a role as Julio Jones's primary backup that summer, given that Julio Jones was, as usual, not practicing and participating in the preseason. So Marvin Hall got a lot of reps with the starting offense that summer. Incredible that starters are actually playing in the preseason at one point in time in the Falcons history. But that being said, he did not wind up making the final roster, all jokes aside. He wound up landing on the Falcons practice squad, but would be activated to the Falcons roster later that season around mid-October. And in his first game against the Miami Dolphins, caught a 40-yard touchdown on his first game. And so that would certainly immediately endear him to me after being impressive the previous summer. And then in 2018, he remained Julio Jones's backup, but also sort of split reps with a then rookie Russell Gage. Hall also served as the team's primary kickoff returner during that 2018 season. But as a way for the Falcons to give Gage greater opportunities at the wide receiver position the following year, as well as the Falcons wanting to make a change in terms of the return game and would ultimately draft return specialist Marcus Green in the 6th round of that 2019 draft, the Falcons basically let Marvin Hall walk and did not opt to re-sign him the following offseason. He would land in Chicago with the Bears that summer, would not make that team, but would first come into contact with the Falcons' current offensive coordinator in Dave Ragone when he was a quarterbacks coach with Chicago, but would wind up going to Detroit later that year and would continue to show himself to be that big play specialist that season in 2019. And over the next year and a half, playing for the Lions in 20 games, he only caught 24 passes, but he was averaging 23 yards per reception, indicating that he was making all those big plays, hooking up many times with the big arm Matt Stafford over the course of that year and a half in Detroit. But then the Lions would wind up letting him go at the end of that 2020 season. He would go with the New England Patriots this past summer, would get cut this past August, and then basically starting in late September. If you were following me on Twitter at Falcons fans, you would often hear me clamoring for either the Falcons to go out there and get a speed wide receiver like Marvin Hall or John Brown, and basically revisiting the timeline of when pushing for the Falcons to add a dynamic, explosive wide receiver. You go all the way back to September 21st when the Falcons first worked out John Brown coming off the heels of that Bucs game. Then a couple of days later was when I first realized that, oh, Marvin Hall got cut by the Patriots. He's also available. Why wouldn't the Falcons go out there and sign him, particularly coming off of the heels of that Giants game where the Falcons struggled once more to become an explosive offense? And then the hope was after the following week, after the Washington game, that the Falcons would wind up signing one of those two players. The Broncos wound up picking up John Brown, but Marvin Hall was still out there. And then eventually, a week or so ago on October 26th, the Falcons did finally work out Marvin Hall a month after they worked out John Brown. And then today on November 2nd is when the Falcons finally signed him. Basically, you have 5 weeks, 6 weeks of pushing for the Falcons to sign Marvin Hall, and they finally did it. And, if you go back to early episodes that I did on here on the podcast, back in early October when I was pushing for the Falcons to first sign Marvin Hall, I talked about how if the Falcons had signed a wide receiver then, like Brown or Hall, you would potentially get those guys ready to play as early as this past week's Carolina game or this upcoming week's New Orleans games, based off of the timeline that we saw from running back Wayne Gallman, who took basically 4 weeks after the Falcons signed him before they ultimately would activate him on game day. And then the 3-week period of time where Mike Pennell, the defensive tackle that the Falcons signed to the practice squad earlier this season, before he was ultimately elevated to the roster and ready to play. So, assuming that there's basically a 3 to 4 week timeline where the Falcons can sign a player and feel pretty comfortable that that player is ready to play, picked up the offense and all those various things, that would probably mean Marvin Hall, based off of this current timeline, would probably not play until after the Thursday night game against the Patriots in week 11. So that week 12 game against the Jaguars or the home game the following week against the Bucs would probably be the first time that we would get an opportunity to see Marvin Hall. Obviously, I wanted to see the Falcons sign that speed threat several weeks ago, but it would have been an indicator that the team saw then that they were lacking that speed threat, which to me was very obvious after the first 2 games, that they needed to go out there and find that guy. And of course, one of the reasons why you would not necessarily believe that the Falcons would drag their feet is, oh, well, they don't have a lot of cap space, or they don't want to necessarily cut a guy. But presumably, we don't know the terms, but we're assuming that Marvin Hall is signing for a veteran minimum contract, and the fact that you would wind up picking him up on the practice squad rather than having to need a roster spot immediately for him. So basically at this point in time, even though it's a little later than I would like to see, you don't look a gift horse in the mouth at this point, or as I often say on this podcast, beggars can't be choosers. So I'm glad it's finally done, that the Falcons, stop twiddling their thumbs. Unfortunately, we had to wait until Calvin Ridley situation led to him taking an indefinite break from football before the Falcons finally stopped twiddling their thumbs and finally got up and said, okay, we need to go out there and make this move that, again, to me was clear as day 6 weeks ago. But as I say, while the team was a little slow on the uptake, as they say, better late than never. And it at least shows the team that is not going to necessarily do the thing that we've seen so many past Falcon teams do, which is always believe that they could develop guys in-house and would have said like, oh, we don't need to go out there and get a speed threat at wide receiver because we have Tajay Sharp, we have Frank Darby, we have Alameda Zaccheaus, and clearly those guys aren't able to provide what the team needs at this position. So what the team needs is obviously that speed threat, and maybe the timeline for Marvin Hall is going to be a little quicker just because he's a little bit more familiar from his past in Atlanta, or the familiarity he has with some of the coaching staff like Dave Ragone means that maybe we don't have to wait 3 to 4 weeks, but maybe we can wait 2 to 3 weeks or something like that. So of course, despite being the conductor of the Marvin Hall hype train, there's always the possibility that in a week or two that the Falcons could wind up parting ways with Marvin Hall because he doesn't necessarily solve the problem. But as I say, I often say, you get credit for trying. Even if Marvin Hall doesn't wind up helping solve the Falcons' problems in terms of adding that speed threat, at least they made an attempt rather than just, again, sitting there and twiddling their thumbs and being like, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how we solve this problem. Like, you go out there and you try to sign somebody to help solve the problem. So we're going to continue today's Locked On Falcons talking about what Marvin Hall is going to bring on the football field. But before we get there, guys, let's talk about what you can bring to your wallet in the form of cash back so that you can save more money at the pump. And I know when you're stuck in bumper to bumper traffic in Atlanta or wherever you call home, you wind up burning through a ton of gas. Why not get some cash back so you can save at the pump with a new app called Getupside? You now can. When you open an account with Getupside, you get 25 cents back per gallon every time you fill up. Over time, that kind of savings can start to add up, with some people making as much as $200 to $300 a month. With Getupside, you not only save, but there's multiple cash out options. You can get direct payments into your bank account. You can get PayPal. You can get your money put into gift cards for Amazon and other places available all the time. And now when you open an account with Getupside and use our special promo code Touchdown, you can get a bonus 25 cents back per gallon on your first fill up. That's up to 50 cents back per gallon. Don't pay full price at the pump anymore. Download the free Getupside app, available in the App Store or on Google Play, and use our promo code Touchdown when you sign up. That's Getupside, promo code Touchdown, to start saving every time you fill up. So the question becomes, what is Marvin Hall bringing to the field? Big plays, of course. And if you've been a regular listener of this podcast for the past several years, you know how much importance I place on offenses being explosive. And I did an episode, there's probably a card above that you can click on, where I talked exclusively about this a week or so ago. So go check out that full episode to get the skinny on that. But basically, the summary was that team success is closely linked to offensive success versus defensive success, and offensive success is closely linked to teams being explosive on offense. And, the reason for that is it's hard to sustain drives in the NFL. When you have to go 10 or 15 plays to go down the field, and when you think about it, like, let's say you have a 12-play drive, and let's say every third play winds up being a third down. So that would mean on a 12-play drive, you would have to convert 4 third downs in order to maintain possession of the ball. And when you look at the best third down offense in the entire NFL, which is currently the Kansas City Chiefs, they only convert about 55% of their third downs. So most teams convert less than half of their third downs. And so the odds are not in your favor if you're forced to have to convert, 4 consecutive third downs on any given drive. The only teams that can do that are the Miami Dolphins on an opening drive against the Atlanta Falcons defense. But outside of that, it's nearly impossible to do that. But big plays, when I refer to big plays, I'm talking about gains of 20 or more yards as big plays, really help out offenses. The average NFL play is about 5.6 yards this year. So if you got a 22-yard gain, that would be the equivalent of basically 4 plays. That's 4 less plays that you need on, one of these drives. That's potentially 1 less third down that you are going to need to convert. And so that puts the advantage back in the offense's favor. That tilts the scales back in the favor of the offense, where you're not forced to have to convert all these consecutive third downs. And so what Hall can do is add a lot more speed and really help take the top off of defenses with his 4.29 speed that he ran at his pro day many years ago. And you go watch any highlight clip of Marvin Hall over these last couple of years, particularly in Detroit, and you're just going to see him running by corners. And we saw this past Sunday where the Falcons tried to go deep to Tajay Sharp, where he was running against, I believe it was Dante Jackson, and he couldn't get on top of it. Now, granted, Jackson is one of the fastest corners in the NFL with a 4.32 40 time, but Hall has the potential to beat that guy in a foot race. And so it gives you a real advantage there going up against even the premier speed threats at that cornerback position. And, obviously it's much easier generating explosive plays when you're throwing the ball down the field rather than having to rely on short throws and yards after catch underneath in order to generate those explosive plays. And we've seen the Falcons kind of have to rely, particularly early in the season, on those sort of underneath throws and a lot of yards after catch. We've seen, Kyle Pitts, particularly the last couple of weeks, really open up more of the vertical element of the offense. But we saw against Carolina when we weren't generating those types of big plays to Kyle Pitts. with Matt Ryan and him not connecting on a couple of deep balls, there wasn't really a whole lot for the Falcons, and they were unable to generate a single explosive play in this game, which is the second time that's happened this year, going back to the Week 1 game against the Eagles. And I don't think it's a coincidence the Falcons struggled to score points in that game and also struggled to score points in this most recent game against Carolina because they weren't able to generate explosive plays. And you don't necessarily need situations like we've seen several times over the last month or so where the Falcons have been able to get those big explosive plays down the field with those vertical bombs from Matt Ryan on, plays to Cordero Patterson or Russell Gage or Kyle Pitts, where we've seen, a safety out of position, and that led to the opening, the Falcons that were able to exploit. You don't need that with Marvin Hall because his speed alone is going to put the safety out of position, right? You don't need the safety to blow that coverage because he's just going to run by that safety, right? That's the value of having a speed threat at that position. And again, without Kyle Pitts generating those explosive plays this past Sunday, it's been hard for the Falcons to generate explosive plays with the rest of their core. And basically, it's Kyle Pitts with assists from Cordero Patterson and Calvin Ridley. The Falcons have 20 plus yard plays this season, which is the second lowest total in the NFL through the first 8 weeks. And Kyle Pitts has accounted for half of those. And then there's 5 more for Cordero Patterson and 3 more for Calvin Ridley. And now you don't have Calvin Ridley. And so, we haven't seen Cordero Patterson generate an explosive play since the Washington game. And it goes back to something I talked about earlier this season where, despite the amazing, incredible start that Cordero Patterson made to the season, I wasn't convinced that that was something that you could, be sustainable and you could rely on for the remainder of the year, just given because Cordero Patterson's production over the first month of the season was just blowing away anything he really had done up to that point in his career. And I just don't know if that was, you could rely on Cordero Patterson to keep sustaining at that rate that he was doing. You go back to, the big plays that he's generated throughout his career, the most he's ever had in a single season was 10 that he had in the rookie year. And that was way back in 2013. And in the year since, he's never had more than 6 in a given season. And so he had 5 in the first 4 weeks of the season. And so like he was already at a career pace. And really the 10 that he had as a rookie, most of those came, I think he had like 8 in the final 6 games of that season. So he got really hot at the end of that, of his rookie season in Minnesota. But since then, you just haven't seen the consistency. So he was off to the best start that he's ever had in his NFL career from an explosiveness standpoint. And you couple that with that necessarily not being sustainable. You couple that with a rookie tight end in Kyle Pitts, where you don't know if you're going to be able to rely on him week in and week out to be able to generate those explosive plays. And we've seen that be the case where, he's either killing it like we saw in the London game against the Jets or in the Dolphins game. And it's not to sit here and say he's not doing anything else in the other games, but it's just, if he's basically providing all the explosiveness to your offense, he's going to be up and down. That's what happens with rookies. You're not going to be able to rely on those guys week in and week out. So, I think getting a player like Hall is going to help take some of the pressure, potentially take some of the pressure off of Kyle Pitts, off of Cordero Patterson, and help fill a little bit of that void that has been sorely missing since we haven't really necessarily seen Calvin Ridley generate the explosive plays that we had seen in previous years. Another player that did generate a big play in that Miami game on a vertical throw was Russell Gage, but then had a very quiet performance against Carolina with 0 targets and 0 catches in this game. And we'll wrap up today's Locked On Falcons answering a listener question over whether or not Russell Gage was getting open in this game, despite the fact that he was not getting particularly many targets. But before we get there, guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And I also have a recommendation for what should be your second listen of the day. And while I don't know the results of Game 6 of the World Series as of this recording, of course, Locked On Braves is going to have you covered for whatever the result is. Locked On Braves is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including on YouTube. So football season is in full swing, and as always, BetOnline is your number one spot for all the pro and college football action this season with a new updated website and interface and even more odds, props, and contests. BetOnline.ag continues to be the number one source for everything football. You can head over to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today with the promo code Locked On, and you'll receive a 50% welcome bonus. The Falcons are currently 6-point underdogs on the road this weekend against the Saints. Maybe you like their odds to potentially finally get that Taysom Hill-sized monkey off of their back this weekend, or you like their odds against Trevor Siemian should Hill's concussion continued to have him sidelined. Regardless, BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports, from football, basketball, baseball, boxing, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait and take advantage of all the amazing offers available at BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. So, Built Bar, the best tasting protein bar on the market, is unveiling a new mystery flavor and a contest that will allow you to guess that flavor ahead of time and win great prizes like a year-long supply of Built Bars, along with other prizes like a Peloton bike, a new iPhone, or a $500 gift card. Go order a box of the mystery flavor right now before the contest ends on November 2nd, or I'm sorry, November 12th. If you're not that adventurous to try their new mystery flavor, of course, there's still the tried and true Built Bar flavors like Paranel Pumpkin, Peanut Butter Brownie, Salted Caramel, Coconut Almond, Blueberry Muffin, and so many more. Built Bars are great because they taste just like a candy bar containing 100% real chocolate. They're soft and easy to chew, but you get none of the guilt of eating a candy bar, particularly this time of year coming off the heels of Halloween, because Built Bars taste great, but they're healthy too. They're low in sugar, low in calories, high in protein, high in fiber. Go order yourself some today at built.com and use the promo code LOCK15 and you'll get 15% off your first order. That's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. So our question comes from One Flew Over the Falcons Nest at Mave2124 on Twitter. Yes, can you check on how Gage did on Sunday in your all-22 review and see if he had trouble getting open? No target seems odd for a supposed number 2 wide receiver. So as is usually the case, it's guys get open, but they're just not getting the ball. And there were a handful of plays, particularly early in the game, where it did seem like the Falcons had an opportunity to get Gage, the ball, and maybe that would have been the preferred target for Matt Ryan, but pressure kind of blew up the play, and Matt Ryan was either forced to check the ball down quicker than he would have liked to, or we had to basically escape the pocket. And therefore, he wasn't able to see Gage breaking over and over the middle or something like that. So, I think there were opportunities for Gage. It wasn't purely he wasn't getting open, but, there weren't that many that I watched on film, instances where it was like, oh, Russell Gage was wide open on this play and he should have gotten the ball. I can probably count on one hand how many instances were that, which, over the course of a game when you're getting 36 snaps is not a big number. But generally speaking, you don't necessarily have to get open 36 times in a game. You just got to get open 5 times. And if the quarterback throws you the ball those 5 times, then you'll probably have a productive game in that regard. So some of it was owed to the fact that I think the Falcons, and this has been a issue throughout the season, whether we've been talking about it with Calvin Ridley or Kyle Pitts, and some of these earlier games where we were talking about why aren't the Falcons being able to get some of these guys more involved in the offense, is that, when teams are deploying their zone coverage against the Falcons, some of the routes that the Falcons ask their guys to run, particularly on the outside, where Gage and Pitts and Ridley have been, tends to lead them to getting bracketed. It's not because they're getting, the defenses are actively doubling them, but it's just there's certain routes where they're running at the safeties. And so therefore, there's the corner underneath in the zone, and then there's a safety over the top. And so therefore, unless Matt Ryan is feeling particularly bold, and the case has been so far this year, that's only really been the situation with Kyle Pitts, he's not going to necessarily throw in the double coverage there and try to fit a ball to Russell Gage. And so, what was interesting in this game was, Gage played 36 snaps, but so did Tajay Sharp. And you talk about Gage being that number 2 receiver, but the fact that Sharp, him and Gage both had the same number of snaps, and there were several instances in this game where, I was keeping an eye as I was watching the film. I was keeping an eye on what Russell Gage was doing, and there were several instances in the game, much more than I realized initially, was that Russell Gage wasn't on the field all that much. 68% of, I think, the snaps is what 36 snaps winds up working out to be, which is not a low number, but certainly is not a high end number, particularly for the guy that as you say, with Ridley out, you would assume he would have been the number 1 wide receiver. And I bring this up because, we've seen Tajay Sharp sort of leapfrog Olamide Zaccheaus in terms of his snap counts this past week. And, given that Sharp, responded with his best game of the season against Carolina, really was the only effective wide receiver that the Falcons had in last Sunday's game, maybe Tajay Sharp will start being seen as the number 2 receiver moving forward, when Ridley gets back. And therefore, until Ridley gets back, we might see Tajay Sharp get more of a workload as the number 1 wide receiver, which is not a positive. It's good for Tajay Sharp, but it's not generally a positive sign for the Falcons, because one of the things I talked about over the summer, I believe, in a podcast back then when I think we were previewing the training camp battles at the wide receiver position. And one of the things I talked about with Tajay Sharp is that you go back to his days in Tennessee where he was a solid, role player for them for several years, but any of those years where he was more than their number 3 wide receiver, or when he was the number 3 wide receiver or higher on the depth chart, the very following offseason, the Titans would go out there and make significant investments at the wide receiver position. I believe that the offseason when they went out and signed Eric Decker and a bunch of other free agents, they went out. That was coming off of the heels of a season where Tajay Sharp was in one of their top 3 wide receivers. The same situation, I think, was the offseason when they went out and drafted A.J. Brown in the second round. Came off the heels of a season with Tajay Sharp. So generally speaking, when Tajay Sharp is one of your top 3 wide receivers, history tells us that teams then decide we don't have a great wide receiver core and we need to invest significantly in that group. And I think that's kind of the case here with the Falcons. But, without being too judgmental on Russell Gage, we haven't necessarily seen really any of the wide receivers shine in this offense outside of, a handful of instances for Tajay Sharp in several of these games. And so I don't want to be too harsh on Russell Gage and criticizing him, because if, if Arthur Smith can't feature Calvin Ridley, who's a much more skillful wide receiver than Russell Gage is, then, what chance does Russell Gage have? So, not to be too harsh on putting criticism on this coaching staff and whatnot, but we just haven't seen really any of these wide receivers. Basically, it's Kyle Pitts and to a lesser extent Patterson, and nobody else is really playing at a high level, with the exception of Tajay Sharp, at least in terms of exceeding expectations there. So, my expectation is that the Falcons will probably wind up investing significant resources at the wide receiver position next offseason, probably much to the chagrin of a lot of folks that want to see this team focus, finally, one of these off seasons on, investing in the defense. I've seen Falcon fans clamoring to have a Panthers like draft haul, where we saw in the 2020 draft where the Panthers used their entirety of their draft class on their defense. And that seems to be paying off for them now in this year, when they have a defense that is performing like a top 10 unit, with several of those young players emerging in that case. But as I've mentioned several times, offense wins championships. And if you want to continue to have Matt Ryan around and justify paying him as much money as we are paying him in order to, keep him as whatever you want to call him, a bridge quarterback or the franchise quarterback for the foreseeable future, wherever you fall on that spectrum, you kind of do need to put weapons around him. So fortunately, hopefully we won't see the Falcons invest in the wide receiver core as well as other offensive positions, despite, needing to invest in those defense. But we'll just sort of see what happens. And hopefully, Marvin Hall will mitigate some of those issues. Maybe Marvin Hall's emergence over the final, 5 or 6 games of the season might lead to the Falcons feeling less compelled to invest those resources at the wide receiver position. So time will tell if with Russell Gage and Marvin Hall and Tajay Sharp and Olamide Zaccheaus and of course Calvin Ridley, what this wide receiver core, there's still a lot of football left to be played, and we'll sort of see what these guys can do the rest of the season. But certainly the better these guys perform, down the stretch, the better it will be, at least to those of you that want to see the Falcons invest fully in the defense, because that means that they will need less investments at the wide receiver position. So we'll just sort of see how that all goes, and hopefully it all works out. And hopefully I won't necessarily have to eat crow on the Marvin Hall sighting, and we see him produce for this team moving forward. But that's going to leave it for us here, guys, on today's Locked On Falcons. And again, thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. And of course, I have plenty of recommendations for that second listen. Of course, Locked On Braves being one. But if you're, looking for more NFL action, you want to hear some insights into all the trade deadline moves, including the Falcons not making any moves, which shouldn't be a surprise in that regard. We had some fun on recent episodes of the podcast speculating about some potential trades, but all of them sort of seem like a fantastical in sort of their cultivation or whatever the case may be. But Peacock and Williamson is that national show that's going to provide you all the coverage that you need on everything that happened on the trade deadline, as well as the coverage of all 32 NFL teams. Go check out the Peacock and Williamson show, featuring NFL analyst Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson. Of course, Peacock and Williamson is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, as well as all the Locked On podcast shows, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. So that's where we're going to leave it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Tomorrow we will be back with a crossover Thursday. as we talk with Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints to get the skinny on this upcoming Week 9 matchup between the Falcons and Saints. Appreciate it, guys. Until then.